The largest group of plant pathogens are the fungi and fungi-like organisms. The fungi-like organisms were originally classified as fungi, but have subsequently been broken out into their own group, and we usually refer to these kind of informally as water molds. Again, this is the largest group of plant pathogens. There are more than roughly 8,000 different organisms in this particular group that can cause disease. And keep in mind that there are lots of additional fungi that are out in the environment, probably about 250,000 that do not cause plant diseases, but there's a large group of the fungi and fungi-like organisms that do. What I like about the fungi is that they are relatively large compared to the other types of disease-causing organisms that we're going to be discussing today, and they can oftentimes be seen with the naked eye. If you've ever been in the grocery store and walked by those mushrooms in the vegetable section, those are fungi, and so as you can tell, again, those are relatively large. A lot of the ones, though, that I tend to look at when I'm looking at disease-causing organisms tend to be microscopic, and I do need to use a microscope to see at least some of the structures that I need to see in order to identify them. Fungi can grow in a couple of different ways. Usually in their day-to-day growth, we call this vegetative growth, and they do this through production typically of structures called hyphae. Singular is hypha without the E, and these are basically long thread-like structures that form the main body of the fungus. Typically these structures are multicellular, so you'll actually be able to see many cells within a given thread, and these can be quite extensive and grow over a large area. Fungi then can go into a reproductive mode, and they can reproduce in a couple of different ways. In both methods, they produce what are called spores. These are seed-like structures, which are basically a propagative unit for the fungus. And these can be produced either asexually or sexually. In asexual reproduction, you can think of this as being similar to a cloning sort of process. If you take one of the spores that's produced by this method and grow up a fungus, the fungus that you get is genetically identical to that mother fungus that produced the spore. In sexual reproduction, it's kind of like humans having kids. Basically, you need two individuals of the fungus that find each other in the environment. They merge, they exchange genetic material, and then there's a spore production process after that. And the spores that are produced here, if you grow up a fungus from sexual reproduction, the fungus that you get from that spore is genetically distinct from either of the two parents. So it's kind of, again, like us having kids. Your kids have the characteristics partly of mom and partly of dad. As I mentioned, when fungi grow vegetatively, they produce what are called hyphae, and this is a photo of the hyphae of a fungus called Rhizoctonia, which is a very common root rot organism. You can see how long and tube-like these structures are. They're kind of like threads. Also, if you take a look at where the black arrow is pointing, you're going to see tiny little lines, and those are what are called crosswalls. That's what divides that long tube into individual cells, and you can find these in certain types of fungi. Oftentimes in the fungi-like organism, these particular structures are missing, and so that's one of the things that I tend to look for when I'm examining fungi under the microscope. I'll definitely look for crosswalls, because if I don't see them, I get a little bit excited because that can indicate I'm dealing with a water mold, and the water molds oftentimes are some of the more destructive of the root rot organisms that I deal with. Rhizoctonia itself is also a destructive root rot organism, and that's what's shown here. What is distinctive about this particular organism is that it doesn't produce spores, and really the only way you can identify it is based on its hyphae. What I do to identify this particular organism is I look at places where the hyphae branch, and again, where the black arrow is pointing here, you can see a branch point, and then I look to see where that crosswall at the branch point is produced. If it's flush with the original hypha from which the branch has been produced, then it's not Rhizoctonia. But if that crosswall is offset just a little bit, forming kind of a T-shaped cell at that intersection, then I know I'm dealing with this organism called Rhizoctonia, and I know I have a problem with a potential root rot organism. When fungi go into reproductive mode and start producing spores, they oftentimes produce the spores in what we generically call fruiting bodies. I mentioned mushrooms before. That's actually a type of reproductive structure and thus a fruiting body of a fungus. In this particular case, we have a fungus called Septoria. It's causing a fruit spot on a cucumber fruit, and the little black blobs that you can see in this photo are the fruiting bodies of that particular fungus. And I have one right next to a black arrow in this particular slide. And if you pluck those off, and this is what I spend a lot of my time doing in the lab, is plucking these off, putting them on a microscope slide in a drop of water, and then squishing them open, and that will release the spores. This particular structure that you see here is kind of a spherical sort of structure. There is technically a pore at the top, and when you break it open, out pop these little tiny spores. They're actually not that tiny. They're actually quite elongated, and they look kind of like cooked spaghetti. So again, fungi produce these sorts of structures quite commonly. In this particular case, the fruiting body is one that's producing asexual spores. So again, if you grow up a fungus from these particular spores, it's going to look genetically identical to the fungus that's causing the infection in this particular situation. Fungi can also produce fruiting bodies when they reproduce sexually. And in this particular case, I'm showing you a picture of the sexual fruiting bodies of one of my favorite fungi. This is a powdery mildew fungus that you're seeing here. And what's interesting about this particular fruiting body is that the center portion is just an enclosed sphere. This one kind of looks like a Pac-Man because I've crushed it open under the microscope. And what I'm trying to do when I crush it open is release bags of spores that will be inside this center sphere. You can actually see one of those bags next to the red arrow. If you take a look at the kind of the mouth of the Pac-Man on that spherical structure, you can also see the edge of another one that's popping out. Inside of these bags, you'll find these kind of brownish, very oval-looking spores, which are very characteristic of the sexual spores of powdery mildew fungi. On the center sphere, which is technically called a chasmathecium, you can also see these kind of radiating arms on that fruiting body. These are modified hyphae called appendages. And what's really cool about these particular structures is they are very, very ornate. And in this particular case, you can see the green arrow. The end of that appendage kind of looks like an antler. And quite frankly, depending upon which powdery mildew you're dealing with, those appendages will have a different sort of look. In this particular case, they look like antlers. There are other types of powdery mildews where those arms will come out and form perfect spirals. There's another type of powdery mildew where they actually look like spikes that come out from that center sphere. And in that particular case, when it gets relatively humid, those arms, those spikes will actually bend down and lift that sphere up off the surface of the leaf. And that helps when the spores are released, getting those spores in wind currents so that they can be moved away from the leaf surface. Quite interestingly, if you know what those appendages look like, you know how many bags of spores that are inside that center sphere, you can actually identify at least a genus, the particular powdery mildew that you're dealing with. In this particular case, you've got more than one bag of spores. You've got these radiating appendages that look like antlers, so that tells me that this particular organism is what's called Microsphaera, and that's a powdery mildew that commonly occurs on viburnum. Fungal spores can come in all different shapes and sizes. I talked about the spores of Septoria being long and spaghetti-like. I showed you the picture of powdery mildew spores, which are rather oval. Some types of fungal spores, like the ones in this picture, are kind of canoe-shaped or banana-shaped and are multicellular. These happen to be spores of a fungus called Fusarium. Certain species of this fungus can be quite aggressive plant pathogens and cause root rots. And Fusarium species tend to be quite prolific spore producers. They produce lots and lots of spores. What's interesting about these is they are multicellular. So if you see all those little lines inside the spore, these are crosswalls, like we talked about when we were discussing hyphae. And they divide that big spore into individual cells. And each one of those cells can potentially germinate, form a fungal thread or a hypha, and infect a plant. So a lot of potential for infection in this particular case. You may notice that these spores look kind of greenish. That's not their natural color. They tend to be colorless. The reason they're green here is because this particular photo was taken with a green filter. While a lot of fungal spores are colorless, there are fungal spores that do have dark pigments, and these are typically produced by fungi that at least during part of their life cycle come into contact with adverse environments, particularly soil, where there are a lot of microorganisms that could potentially use the spores as a food source. These pigments are melanins, and these are actually antimicrobial agents, so they keep the spores from being parasitized by other microorganisms in the environment. This particular spore is one of a fungus called Thalaviopsis. I affectionately call this the Tootsie Roll fungus because this particular fungus has spores that look like Tootsie Rolls. They're long, they're brown. You'll notice in that center spore, it's divided up into individual cells, so it's multicellular, and those cells actually break off like the section of a Tootsie Roll, and each one of those sections can potentially infect a plant. These particular spores are actually embedded in root tissue. That's all of that kind of gold material that you see in the background. You can also see hyphae of this particular fungus growing through that root tissue as well. This particular fungus, again called Thalaviopsis, is a root rot organism that we commonly see in greenhouse settings. It causes a disease called black root rot, and we typically see it on greenhouse-grown plants like geraniums and petunias. The spores that we've talked about up to this point are primarily designed for both reproduction and also dissemination, that is, movement of the fungus from point A to point B in the environment. Certainly those dark-colored spores of Thalaviopsis, that Tootsie Roll fungus, also have a function for survival. And in this particular slide, another example of a spore where the primary function of the spore is to help the organism survive in really adverse environmental conditions. There's a black arrow in this particular slide pointing to this kind of circular structure. This is what's called an oospore. This is a resting spore that's produced by those fungi-like water molds that I talked about earlier. And you can see how many of these spores are embedded in this tissue. This is actually root tissue. What you'll notice about these spores is that they have a very, very thick wall, and that's what helps them be very, very stable, particularly when they get into a soil environment. There are certain oospores of certain types of water molds. In particular, there have been some reports of oospores of the organism Phytophthora, again a common root rot organism, that can survive for up to 40 years in soil. And think about that in the context of how you're going to manage an organism that can survive for that long. Now, you may have noticed that I've been using a lot of food analogies. I never really had a good food analogy for this particular spore until one of my students came up one time and said, those look like Cheerios. So we're going to dub this the Cheerios fungus. Hopefully that'll help you remember that these are oospores and that these help with the survival of this particular organism. Now that I've discussed the general characteristics of fungi, what I'd like to do is introduce you to a couple of fungal diseases that I think you should be able to identify by eye. The first of these diseases is powdery mildew, and this particular disease is shown here on somewhat of an unusual plant and an unusual plant part. This is on African violet, and you notice all of this kind of white material that's growing on the flowers in this particular situation. Now, most of the time when you see powdery mildews, you're going to see them on leaves. For example, if you're out in your yard and you look at a lilac shrub, oftentimes we see powdery mildews, this white powdery material that grows on the surface of the leaves. But on this particular host, African violet, we tend to see the symptoms on the flowers. What's characteristic about powdery mildews is that they tend to produce a lot of growth along the surface of whatever plant part they're infecting, and a lot of that white material that you're seeing is actually asexually produced spores. Now, you may have noticed that I talked about powdery mildews in the plural. That's because there are lots and lots of different fungi that potentially can cause powdery mildew, and these particular fungi are relatively specific in terms of their host range. So we have one powdery mildew that can cause the disease on African violet. There's another powdery mildew fungus that causes the disease on lilacs, another powdery mildew that can potentially cause the disease on cucumbers and squashes and those sorts of plants. So again, we're talking about a large group of closely related organisms. They are all characterized by having this kind of whitish growth that occurs, again, primarily on the surface of the plant. They do penetrate into the epidermal layer of the tissue, so that's that outer layer of tissue of a leaf, or in this particular case, a flower. And they produce kind of an octopus-like structure called a haustorium, and it has these fingers on it that help absorb nutrients out of the plant. Most of the time, powdery mildews are relatively cosmetic diseases, but on occasion, on certain hosts, they can cause some leaf loss and cause leaves to dry up. In particular, I see a lot of problems on phlox. Also on bee balms or monardas, I see a lot of problems. Also, if you ever get powdery mildews on cucurbits, so squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, that sort of thing, we can also see a lot of leaf drying due to powdery mildews as well. Part of what they do is as they're growing across the leaf surface or the flower surface, when they produce those haustoria, that opens up a small hole in the leaf surface that allows moisture to escape. And if you get enough of these infected areas on the leaf, that will cause a lot of dehydration, a lot of moisture loss, and that's what leads to the leaves drying up. In terms of management of powdery mildews, one of the best things that you can do if you've had a chronic problem in your yard is try to make sure you do good fall cleanup, because powdery mildews oftentimes overwinter in old plant debris, and so making sure you collect up all of the infested material that's died back in the wintertime and getting that out of your yard can reduce the amount of fungal spores that are likely to be produced the following year. Unfortunately, that does not totally take care of the problem because many powdery mildew fungi will also overwinter not only in this plant debris, but they can also overwinter in overwintering buds on perennials. So they kind of hang out there, wait for the environmental conditions to be appropriate, and then they can reinfect a plant as it begins to sprout the following year. Now, in terms of environmental conditions, really the driving factor that will really get powdery mildews going is relative humidity. They're a little bit unusual compared to other types of fungal pathogens that will infect leaves and flowers in that most of these other fungi really like wet leaf surfaces. They require what's called a leaf wetness period. So that's a length of time where there's actually a thin film of water on the leaves. But that's not what powdery mildews like. They like a dry leaf surface, but really, really high humidity around the leaf. And again, keep in mind that plants are their own mini humidity generators. They transpire, they naturally lose water through the leaves, and that creates a little humid cloud along the leaf surface. So one of the things that you need to do in order to manage powdery mildews is try to remove that humid air, and that's really a function of how much airflow is occurring around plants. So anything you can do to thin out plants, allow better airflow, will really help you in terms of clearing out that humid air and making a less favorable environment for powdery mildews to occur. So thinning is important, or if you're establishing a new garden, make sure that you plant plants far apart so that you end up getting good airflow between the plants. Other things you can consider for control include use of resistant varieties, certainly in phlox and rose, which can be hit pretty hard with powdery mildews as well. There are resistant varieties that are sold, and unfortunately, while you may get good disease control, these particular varieties may not have other horticultural characteristics that you're really interested in terms of flower color and that sort of thing. Also, if you're growing cucurbits, oftentimes they have been bred for resistance to powdery mildew, but again, the fruits that you get off these plants may not have the flavor that you want, but it's certainly an option. Other sorts of things that you can consider, there are fungicide treatments, and many of them, for controlling powdery mildews. As with most fungicide treatments, though, these applications need to be made before you see any symptoms, or in this particular case, it's what we call signs, where you see the actual fungus on the leaf or on the flower. You need to make these applications before you see any evidence of the disease in order for them to be effective. These fungicide treatments are really preventative treatments, not curative treatments. And while there are lots of commercial products that are available for powdery mildew control, what I normally recommend for most homeowners as a start is kind of a home remedy that's based off of some research that was done at Cornell University. What you do is you take 1.5 tablespoons of baking soda and 3 tablespoons of a lightweight horticultural oil. We'll come back to that in just a second. You mix that in a gallon of water, and again, you apply this as a preventative treatment. With any of these fungicide treatments, whether it's this baking soda concoction or the commercial products, you need to get good coverage. Cover the upper surface of the leaves, the lower surface of the leaves, the stems. Any part of the plant that potentially can become infected needs to be covered. Now, getting back to this baking soda concoction, I mentioned lightweight horticultural oil. There are many types of horticultural oil that are on the market. Most of them are overly heavy in terms of their weight for use for this particular application. Definitely, you do not want to use something like dormant oil. There's a reason it's called dormant oil. That particular oil is designed for use when plants are dormant. If you apply it to leaves, it will burn them. People have also tried to use motor oil, which is a great way to kill plants. Definitely, that's not a useful oil in this particular context. When we're talking about lightweight horticultural oil, we're really talking about probably a paraffin-based oil. And one of the brands that's been recommended through the University of California is something called Safety Side, SAF-T-SIDE. And that particular product is available for purchase online, and you can buy it in reasonable quantities that you would use in a home garden. In terms of when you apply these particular materials, what I normally do is, if you've gardened for a long time and have a good sense of when powdery mildews typically show up in your yard, then what I would suggest would be to go back about 3 weeks before that time point and start applications. Again, you want to apply these products preventatively. In my own garden, I usually start to see powdery mildews about the 1st of July, but again, that can vary from location to location. The other thing that you can do is make applications based on the relative humidity that you can monitor through your favorite weather site. When you start to see humidities that are roughly 60 to 70% that are being reported, that would be a point where the humidity along the leaf surface is probably getting pretty close to 100%, and that would be a great time to start applications. But again, with any sort of fungicide application, you really have to weigh the pros and cons of whether you want to do this. It does take a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it can be somewhat expensive on occasion, and sometimes it's really better to forego the fungicide treatments and replace the plant with something else that's less prone to powdery mildews. And if you decide to go with a resistant variety, do keep in mind that resistance is not perfect. Even though you have a resistant variety, it will still come down with some powdery mildew. And the level of powdery mildew can really depend upon environmental conditions. I usually have a conversation at least once during a growing season with someone who comes in, usually bearing a powdery mildew resistant phlox plant, and kind of shakes it in my face and says, "Look at this plant. I bought it at the garden center. They told me it was resistant to powdery mildew, and look at all the powdery mildew on this particular plant." And what I have to explain to the person is that if that were a susceptible variety, it would look even worse. Sometimes, even when we have really conducive environmental conditions, if it's really muggy during the summer, even resistant varieties will have a fair amount of powdery mildew. Just keep that in mind as you're weighing your options for management for this particular disease. Another very easy to identify group of fungal diseases are the rust diseases. And again, we're really talking about a large group of fungi that can cause these diseases. They're all very closely related, and they can cause problems on a variety of different types of plants. Rust fungi tend to be relatively host specific. In this particular case, I'm showing you an example of what's called rose rust. And this is a very classic looking rust, because what you tend to get with the classic looking rust, if you look at the top surface of the leaf, you're going to see some kind of either brownish or orangish spots. But what you really need to do to identify it as a rust disease is basically flip the leaf over and take a look on the bottom surface of the leaf and look for little erupting masses of fungal spores that are being produced. And these are typically kind of a bright orange or a gold yellow color, or they can be kind of a rusty brown sort of color. What you can do is actually, if you rub your finger or a Kleenex or a white handkerchief across the surface of the leaf, if you have a rust, you're actually going to rub off streaks of color. And that's really the classic way of identifying whether or not you have one of these rust diseases. There are a lot of leaf diseases that are caused by fungi that will produce kind of brownish or orange spots, but it's only the rust where you actually get this spore production that you can rub off with your finger. In this particular case, rose rust is what's called an autoecious rust. That means that this particular rust fungus is able to complete its entire life cycle on a single host. So this particular fungus just lives on rose plants. In addition to these really orangey, powdery spores that are produced, late in the season it will start to convert its spore production into an overwintering spore. That's called a teleospore. These orange ones are called eurydiaspores. What I love about the teleospores of this particular fungus, this rose rust, is it looks like a little corn dog. Actually, if you look at it under the microscope, there's a part of it that looks like a frankfurter and then a part of it that looks like a stalk. And actually, these resting spores, these teleospores, are so large that you can actually see them by eye on the leaf surface. They actually look like little insect droppings. Watch for that. This is a disease that we haven't seen a lot of in Wisconsin. It's more of a warm weather sort of rust. But we're seeing more of it as our climate tends to warm up and we get milder winters. So you may see this on your roses in the future. The other major group of rusts are what are called the heteroecious rusts. As opposed to the autoecious rust, the heteroecious rusts require two different hosts in order to complete their life cycle. Probably the most common one that folks tend to see is one called cedar apple rust, and that particular rust fungus spends part of its life on red cedar or junipers in general, and then the other part of its life cycle on woody rosaceous plants like apple, crabapple, hawthorn, and quince. What you typically see first in the growing season is the stage on junipers, and it's quite vivid. If you've ever seen these large marmalade-like masses that occur on junipers, particularly red cedar, you've seen cedar apple rust. Kind of an amusing story. We had a student on campus who told the head of our grounds crew one time that she really loved mid-May to mid-June on campus because that's when the junipers bloomed. And what the student was actually seeing were these masses of spores that were being produced by the cedar apple rust fungus. The spores that are produced in those masses do not reinfect the junipers. They actually infect the alternate host, so it's one of those rosaceous plants like apple, crabapple, hawthorn, or quince. And then what you start to see mid-season on those hosts are very, very distinctive leaf spots that are about the size maybe of a dime or a nickel. They're usually very bright in color, yellow or orange, and if you look at the lower surface, eventually you'll start to see these little tentacles that are formed below the leaf surface, and these produce spores that eventually reinfect the junipers. This fungus bounces back and forth. Other types of heteresis rust that you may have come across, there's one called white pine blister rust, and this can be a serious problem on white pine where it can kill white pine trees. It actually causes an infection on the branches and causes the branches to die. The alternate host for that particular rust fungus is gooseberry or currants, where you actually see symptoms that are very similar to what I'm showing here on rose. So you get these very bright orange pustules or masses of spores that are produced on the leaves. The other alternating rust that you may have encountered is the one that goes to turf. If you've ever walked out into your lawn and gotten orange shoes, you're dealing with an alternating or heteresis rust. That particular rust spends part of its life cycle on turf, the other part of its life cycle on, of all things, buckthorn. If you're not familiar with buckthorn, it's a very invasive woody ornamental. It will take over understories in wooded areas, and if you need another reason to hate that particular plant, there are three. It's invasive, it's an alternate host for this grass rust, and then a third reason to hate it, particularly if you're a farmer who grows soybeans, is that it's an overwintering site for soybean aphid. In terms of management of rust diseases, that really depends upon the type of rust that you're dealing with. Oftentimes with the autoecious rust, good cleanup of the infected leaves, also pruning on roses of infected canes can help with management of that particular disease. With the alternating rust, sometimes choosing to grow only one of the hosts. For example, with cedar apple rust, you decide whether you're going to be a connoisseur of junipers or a connoisseur of woody rosaceous plants and grow only one of them. Although quite frankly, in tight urban settings, that doesn't often really work that well, because you may decide that you're going to grow just crab apples, but your neighbor will grow some junipers and the plants will be close enough for spores to float back and forth. There are also fungicide treatments, but if you're ever interested in that particular option, that's a situation where you'd want to contact someone like me to get a specific recommendation for the particular rust that you're dealing with. But again, rusts in general are diseases that you should be able to identify by eyes, so definitely watch for those out in the landscape as you look for plant diseases in the future. While powdery mildew diseases and rust diseases are relatively easy to identify, unfortunately, a lot of other fungal diseases are going to be much more of a challenge. So what I'd like to do as we continue talking about fungi is give you kind of a broad perspective on the sorts of symptoms that you might expect to be caused by fungal pathogens. One of the most common of the symptoms caused by fungi are spots. These are basically localized, relatively circular, infected areas, often necrotic, so dead, that occur on soft tissues, particularly leaves. And you can see an example of this here. This is a disease called black spot. It occurs on elms. There is a black spot disease that you may have heard of that occurs on roses, but that's caused by a different fungus than the one that's involved here. With both of these diseases, what you get are these roughly circular dead areas on leaves. In this particular case, you can see a little bit of a yellow halo around the dead areas. We do sometimes see that with fungal pathogens that occur on leaves, but we more likely are going to see a yellow halo when we're dealing with a bacterial pathogen, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. When you see a lot of spotting occurring on a leaf to the point where a portion of the leaf or the entire leaf just collapses, then we start talking about a symptom called a blight. And probably the most common of the blights that you're likely to encounter are the blights that affect tomatoes. If you've ever had a tomato plant that started to get brown leaves in the bottom and then that works up the plant to the point where the plant is totally defoliated, you've encountered fungal leaf blights. And there are basically two different diseases that are involved that we typically see causing blights on tomato with that bottom-up sort of defoliation. And both of those are shown in this particular slide. On the left is a disease called early blight. If you live around the Stevens Point area where there's a lot of production of potatoes, you've most likely seen this disease before because early blight goes both to tomatoes and to potatoes, and so we tend to see a lot of this disease up in that central sands region of Wisconsin. The characteristics of the individual spots are that they are relatively large. They usually start out being roughly about a half an inch to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and you can see several spots of that size on this left leaf. Oftentimes, if you look very carefully at that dead tissue, what you're going to see is something that looks like a target pattern, so some concentric rings. That's very characteristic of that particular disease. And again, you get so many infections by this fungus on a leaf that portions of the leaf and then the entire leaf begin to collapse. And I have a black arrow showing you an area of the leaf where there are so many infections where that leaf tissue just started to totally die, and eventually this entire leaf will collapse and die as well. On the right is the other, probably more common of the leaf blight diseases. It's called Septoria leaf spot. I see a lot of this in home gardens, particularly in the southern part of the state, but elsewhere in Wisconsin as well. With this particular disease, the fungus infects. It forms a relatively small spot to begin with, usually with a very bleached center and a little bit of a dark halo around the edge, usually black or a dark maroon color. And again, you get so many infections per leaf that eventually the entire leaf collapses and you get total leaf death. These particular diseases can be a challenge to manage. The best time to start managing these leaf blights is actually in the fall after you've had a problem. Make sure you do really good fall cleanup. Collect as much of that old tomato debris that may harbor these fungi as you possibly can and remove it from your garden. If you're a good hot composter, where you have a compost pile that gets up to high temperature and you routinely turn that material so that the outer material that's cold gets to the center where it can heat up and decay, if you're a good hot composter, you could actually compost this material. But if you're like me, and my idea of a compost pile is just that you throw material in a pile in the back of your yard, that's not a good place to put this sort of debris, because if you don't get that rotting and heating of the material, and that material is just sitting around, it can harbor the fungus over the winter. The fungus will sporulate in the spring, and that can lead to problems next year. So it's best to collect up that material. If you don't do good hot composting, definitely get it out of your yard and get it away from where you're going to be growing tomatoes next year. As you go into the following spring and decide that you're going to plant tomatoes again, you may want to consider resistant varieties, although I don't necessarily think that that's a great option in many cases. There are some varieties of tomatoes that have resistance to these common leaf blights. Unfortunately, the flavor of the tomatoes that are produced typically is not that great. What scientists have discovered is that the genes for resistance to these diseases are on the tomato chromosomes very close to the genes for flavor. So what you tend to get is either a plant that's very susceptible to these leaf blights that tends to have a really tasty tomato, or you have a plant that's very resistant that has fruits that taste kind of like cardboard. A lot of the cherry tomatoes tend to have at least some resistance to these leaf blights, and unfortunately you know that the cherry tomatoes oftentimes don't have the best of flavors. So that is an option, but it's not, in my mind, the best option for management. The other thing you should be very aware of when you go to plant your plants the following growing season is try to move your tomatoes to a new area in your garden. You want to keep them away from where you had tomatoes last year. That's because even though you've been really diligent about collecting up all of the old plant material from last year, there are going to be little bits of leaf that you haven't been able to collect that have filtered down into the soil. Those are going to harbor these leaf blight fungi, and those are going to produce spores, and those can potentially lead to additional infections the following year. So you want to move your plants to a new area in your garden if possible. Also make sure that you plant your plants as far apart as you possibly can. What you really want to do is make sure that when your tomato plants are full size, the foliage does not overlap. So you want to get good spacing between the plants so you get good airflow. And the reason why you want that is because you want to dry the plants as quickly as possible. So if the leaves get wet, you want them to dry really quickly, because these leaf blight fungi really require long periods of leaf wetness, again, a film of water on the leaf, in order for the spores to germinate and infect. So good spacing is critical to get good drying. Also, as the plants get larger, you may want to thin them a bit in order to, again, open up the canopy, increase airflow, and also decrease drying time. Other things to keep in mind once you get those plants in place is to mulch under your plants. You don't need much of a mulch layer, maybe about an inch. Quite frankly, I would recommend going back to the area where you had tomatoes last year and mulching over that area as well. What this little inch of mulch is doing is forming a physical barrier, so that if you are getting spore production in those little bits of old plant debris in the soil, it blocks those spores from getting out of the soil and to your plants. If you start to see some disease during the growing season, you can pluck off those leaves. That will remove a source of additional spores that might reinfect your plant and will also open up the canopy to promote more rapid drying. The other really important thing to keep in mind as you're growing tomatoes is how you water. Definitely do not use a sprinkler to irrigate your tomatoes because that gets the leaves wet, and again that creates these leaf wetness periods that are very beneficial to these blight organisms and will promote the spores germinating and the fungus infecting. So if you're going to water your tomatoes, definitely water at the base. And what I typically suggest is something like a soaker hose that you can just string along the base of the plants and will apply that water very, very slowly into the root zone where it's needed and keep that moisture off the leaves. So a soaker hose, a drip hose, those are good options for watering tomatoes. If you get absolutely desperate, there are fungicide treatments that you could potentially use. But in my mind, if you need to apply fungicides to your tomatoes, quite frankly, in terms of cost and time and effort, you're probably better off going to a local farmer's market and buying tomatoes there. Another type of symptom that you can commonly see caused by fungi is something called a canker. Cankers are very similar in a way to leaf spots in that they are very localized infected areas, but with cankers they tend to occur on tougher plant parts, things like stems, branches, and trunks. In this particular example, we have a canker that's occurring on a honey locust tree. You can see this very elongated area where it is sunken and tissue has disappeared due to the infection. This is what's called Nectria canker. Nectria is a type of fungus that very commonly causes cankers on a variety of woody ornamentals. In this particular case, the fungus most likely entered in through a pruning wound. If you take a look at the center of that cankered area, you can see where there was a branch that was cut off. And you'll notice a couple things about this. It's very, very flush cut. That is, it's cut very, very close to the trunk, which made a very, very large area through which the fungus could enter. And what I also suspect happened in this particular case is that the pruning tools of the person who was pruning were probably contaminated. It's very easy to pick up canker fungi on cutting tools, and if you don't decontaminate between cuts, you can actually transfer these fungi from plant to plant as you prune. Best way to get rid of fungi on pruning tools is to either use something like 10% bleach or even a little better, 70% alcohol. Bleach can be a little bit corrosive to metal tools, but 70% alcohol works quite well. You can use something like rubbing alcohol or also some of the spray disinfectants. Lysol or other brands oftentimes contain about 70% alcohol, and you can just spray those onto your tools and allow them to air dry. Also notice in this particular picture that even though there's a canker there, the tree is trying to respond to that infection. Take a look at those rolls of tissue along the edge of the infected area. That's actually what's called callus tissue, and that's the plant's response to try to cover over the wound that's been caused by this infection. Unfortunately, with this particular tree, I know where this tree used to be. Notice past tense. This was a honey locust that was outside my building on the UW-Madison campus. Even though the tree is responding, the fungus is still there. It eventually became active again, the canker enlarged, and eventually the top part of this tree died because the trunk was girdled and the tree was removed. Fungi can also cause a variety of different types of rots, and typically when we're talking about rots, we modify the word rot by telling you what part of the plant is rotting. In this particular slide, what you're looking at is what's called a crown rot. That's because the infection by the fungus that's involved here has occurred in the part of the plant that's near the soil line, that is the crown of the plant. And as you can see, there's this kind of mass destruction of this particular plant, which is a hosta. This specific disease is something called southern blight. It's one of the nastier of the fungal diseases. Quite frankly, it's about the most aggressive fungal disease that I really encounter on a regular basis. And this particular fungus, it's called Sclerotium ralphsii, I love the name of that fungus, is typically more of a tropical or subtropical pathogen. We used not to see it a lot here in Wisconsin. Our typical, very cold, what I consider classic Wisconsin winters kept this particular pathogen under check. Unfortunately, as our climate has warmed a bit and we've had milder winters, this particular fungus is able to survive here in the state much more so than it used to be able to. This is actually a relatively easy disease to identify if you can look for the right things. You can see a white arrow in this particular picture, and it's pointing to a whole bunch of little tiny spherical tan structures that are clinging to one of the petioles on the leaves. And you can see a lot of these if you look in that crown tissue. These little round structures are what are called sclerotia. They are a resting structure of this particular fungus, and they help the fungus survive during adverse weather conditions. What they are is basically a whole bunch of fungal hyphae packed very tightly together with a little colored rind. And they can range in color from kind of a tannish color to kind of a reddish color. And they're about the size of an osmocote pellet or some types of very small seeds. And this particular organism produces lots and lots of them. The first time I ever encountered southern blight was in the Allen Centennial Gardens at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, just very close to where I work on campus. They had a flower bed in front of the garden that was just decimated by something, and they called me over. By the time I got over there to do a diagnosis, they'd lost about 40 square foot of plant material in this bed. That's how aggressive this particular pathogen is. And when I started looking at all of these dead plants, I kind of moved away the tops of the plants and looked down towards the base. There were these sclerotia everywhere. They were covering the base of the stems. They were all over the mulch that they had around these plants, and it was just a mass of sclerotia everywhere. The other thing that you can also see a little bit in this particular photo is a little bit of whitish material. Those are masses of fungal hyphae that are produced by this particular fungus, and that's the other thing that you can look for to identify southern blight. So a combination of a lot of dead plants dying very rapidly, these sclerotia, and a little bit of hyphal growth from the fungus. This is a very difficult disease to manage. What I typically tell folks when they see this is that what they need to do is kind of delimit where they see the infected areas. So watch around the plants on the mulch and look for sclerotia. Find the edge of where the sclerotia are forming. Go out about 1 foot to 2 feet beyond that. And from that outer edge back towards the center, start to remove and dig up plants and bag them in garbage bags in place, and then remove those plants wholesale from the garden. I also tell them to take about 1 inch of the topsoil. And this is one of the few diseases where I actually tell folks, if you have this, once you've removed all this plant material, come back in and definitely use fungicide treatments, because you really need to try to keep this disease under check. And quite frankly, you will probably, even if you do all of this, continue to have problems with this disease for a while, because it's very easy to pick up those sclerotia on shoes, on tools, on, say, the wheel of your wheelbarrow, and then you can move the fungus from area to area in your garden. In general, it's always important as you're moving around in your garden to routinely decontaminate your tools, your shoes, anything that comes into contact with potentially contaminated either plant material or soil. And again, for metal objects, you can use 70% alcohol. For things like shoes, you could use something like 10% bleach. In addition to crown rots, you can also see fruit rots. This is an example of a squash that's been infected by one of the fungi-like organisms, one of the water molds called Phytophthora. So this is Phytophthora fruit rot. With the fungal rots, oftentimes the tissue that's rotted is quite dry. It isn't really soft and mushy and slimy. You can see a little bit of sliminess at the center of the infection, but that's likely due to other sorts of organisms like bacteria entering into the rotted tissue after the Phytophthora had done its job. If you look at the lower left edge of this particular fruit, you can actually see kind of the edge of where the infected area is. This fruit has a little bit of a whitish sheen to it. The organism is probably sporulating on the surface if you looked at it microscopically. But again, there's a lot of kind of dry decay of the fruit tissue. And if you had found this particular fruit in the field, that flat area with a kind of sliminess would probably have been on the soil, because oftentimes it's where the fruits come into contact with the soil that the Phytophthora enters the fruits. Phytophthora tends to be a soil-borne pathogen. Other types of rots that are caused by fungi include root rots. This is where you get a decay in the root system. This inhibits water uptake, and thus probably the first symptom that you're going to see associated with a root rot is some sort of wilting, like the wilting that you see in this cineraria, which has a root rot caused by the water mold Pythium. If you saw this particular plant at my house, the problem would not be a root rot. It would be drought stress. I tend to use the wilt technique for watering my house plants. So if I see a wilted plant, that means it must need water. Now, most people don't work that way. They tend to water their plants routinely. So you definitely need to evaluate when you see a wilted plant, what's going on in the soil. You need to feel down in that soil and check to see whether it's moist. At my house, it's going to be bone dry, and you need to add some water. If the soil is really moist, then you're probably dealing with some sort of root rot problem. Now, what's our typical response when we see a plant like this, though? What do? We typically water the plant, and the plant continues to wilt, and what do? we water the plant again. And unfortunately, what you're doing, if you look in the soil, the little root rot organisms are doing kind of a happy dance down there, because what you've done, remember that disease triangle in the corner that said favorable environment? You've basically made that favorable environment really, really huge, because root rot organisms tend to like wet soils. So one of the things you need to do if you think you have a root rot problem is cut back on water. You need to give the plant enough water to survive, but you want to keep things relatively dry, because that tends to at least partially inactivate these organisms that are causing the root rot. In a situation like this, with this particular plant, there's enough damage that, quite frankly, I wouldn't even attempt to save this plant. I would just pitch it, pot and all. We usually don't recommend recycling plastic pots if there's been a root rot problem. People have tried bleaching plastic pots and it just doesn't seem to work particularly well. My recommended decontamination for plastic when you've had a root rot problem is, quite frankly, incineration. Now, clay and ceramic pots, you can decontaminate those. Typically, a recommendation is to soak pots for roughly 20 to 30 minutes in a 10 to 20% bleach solution and then rinse the pots before you use them. I've mentioned lack of watering and root rots as two reasons why you might see wilting in plants. There is another group of diseases where wilting is a primary symptom. They're called vascular wilt diseases. And what happens with these particular diseases is that the pathogens, in this particular case we're dealing with fungal pathogens, they enter into the plant, they get established in the water conducting tissue, the xylem, and they lead to blockages in that tissue. So the plants can take up water, but they can't transport it from the roots to the upper branches, and that leads to wilting and dieback in the plants. Some of our very, very serious tree diseases are vascular wilt diseases. You've probably heard of Dutch elm disease, probably also heard of oak wilt. These are both vascular wilt diseases. In this particular slide, I'm showing you a third vascular wilt disease called verticillium wilt. Now, Dutch elm disease is pretty specific to elms. Oak wilt is pretty specific to oaks. With verticillium wilt, though, that particular disease goes to a variety of different types of woody ornamentals. Also, it will go to herbaceous plants, and also it's a big problem on certain vegetable crops as well. The pathogen is called verticillium. Again, it gets into the plant, gets into the water conducting tissue, and blocks it off. What we typically see, at least initially, on the outside of the plant is wilting and dieback. And then one of the things I look for when I'm trying to diagnose this is I will cut off a branch that is wilting and I start peeling off the bark. And that's what I'm showing in this particular slide. When you have these vascular wilt diseases, oftentimes if you peel off the bark and look right underneath the bark, that's where the xylem is located, you'll typically see a lot of browning or some sort of discoloration. It can be a solid mass, it can be streaks, but you will see some sort of discoloration. This is called vascular discoloration, vascular browning. Could be vascular greening. Lots of times in maples with verticillium, the discoloration is more of a green rather than a brown, but you'll see this discolored tissue right underneath the bark. And you can see it here in this particular slide where the black arrow is pointing. And that's giving you a sense of where the pathogen is colonizing the water conducting tissue. And I use this as a guide when I'm trying to culture from these wilted branches. So I take little bits of that discolored tissue, I put it on a growth medium, and I try to get the fungus to grow out of that tissue. And that's how I eventually identify whether I'm dealing with Dutch elm disease or oak wilt or verticillium wilt. These are really, really nasty diseases. Typically, when we have oak wilt, Dutch elm disease, verticillium wilt, basically the trees are going to die. We are really talking about tree removal. And then particularly with verticillium wilt, because the pathogen has such a wide host range, we have to be very, very careful what we replant in that area.